There are landscapes where cold itself becomes a kind of memory, where ice holds what time would otherwise dissolve, where the frozen ground refuses to surrender the dead. Across the high latitudes of our planet, from the Siberian taiga to the Alpine glaciers, from the wind-scoured steppes of Central Asia to the silent cave systems of Eastern Europe, a peculiar archive has been accumulating for millennia, one written not in stone or parchment, but in preserved flesh, in frozen offerings, in the still supple sinews of bodies that should have returned to dust thousands of years ago. These are the ice-preserved anomalies, the mummies and offerings and ritual burials that emerge from melting permafrost and retreating glaciers as if stepping out of a doorway left ajar between epochs. And as the climate shifts and the ancient cold loosens its grip, more of these silent witnesses are appearing with each passing season, their presence raising questions that neither archaeology nor climatology can fully answer. What were they preserving? What did they believe would happen to the bodies they so carefully interred in frozen ground? And why, in some cases, are modern researchers so eager to return these finds to the Earth, or to ship them to undisclosed facilities where no further study takes place? Sit back, relax, and let the cold carry us through several hours of ice, mystery, and the dead who will not stay forgotten. Our journey begins in the Siberian permafrost, that vast frozen substrate stretching beneath the taiga and tundra of northern Russia, a region so immense that it contains nearly a quarter of the northern hemisphere's landmass. The permafrost here reaches depths of over 1,000 meters in some locations, a column of frozen earth that has remained unbroken for tens of thousands of years, sealing within its crystalline matrix everything that sank into it during the Pleistocene and after. For most of human history, this frozen ground kept its secrets absolutely, revealing nothing to the peoples who walked above it, who built their camps and grazed their reindeer across its surface, without ever suspecting what lay preserved beneath their feet. But the ground is warming now. The active layer, that thin skin of soil that thaws each summer, is deepening year by year, and as it does, objects are surfacing that should not still exist, bodies that should have decomposed millennia ago, organic materials that defy every conventional understanding of preservation. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of Siberian permafrost mummies is straightforward enough. The cold prevented bacterial decomposition. The anaerobic environment, sealed beneath frozen soil, halted the oxidation that would otherwise reduce soft tissue to nothing. The bodies found emerging from melting tundra are simply the fortunate victims of a natural deep freeze, no different in principle from the frozen mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses that occasionally appear, tusks intact, hair still clinging to desiccated hide. The science of taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay and fossilize, provides a clear enough mechanism. Low temperatures slow enzymatic activity. Permafrost excludes oxygen and the aerobic bacteria that require it. The result is preservation, sometimes startlingly complete, but ultimately explicable through physical and chemical processes alone. Yet certain aspects of these finds continue to invite deeper reflection. The first and most persistent anomaly is the selectivity of what survives. Permafrost is not a uniform medium. It shifts, it cracks, it breathes with the seasons in ways that should, over thousands of years, admit enough moisture and microbial activity to reduce any organic material to fragments. And yet the bodies that emerge are not fragments. The Yakut mummies discovered near the Yana River in recent decades have included individuals with intact facial features, with hair still braided, with stomach contents that can be analysed to determine their final meals. The preservation is not merely good, it is, in many cases, better than what modern embalming achieves, better than the carefully prepared mummies of ancient Egypt, despite the absence of any deliberate chemical treatment, any evisceration, any removal of organs. The cold alone, we are told, accounts for this. But does cold alone explain why some bodies emerge nearly perfect, while others, buried in apparently identical conditions, are reduced to scattered bones? The Siberian permafrost has yielded bodies from many eras, from the Paleolithic to the medieval period, and the pattern of preservation does not correlate neatly with depth or location. Some of the oldest finds are among the best preserved. Some of the most recent are barely recognizable. The variable is not time, it is not simple temperature. Something else seems to govern which bodies the ice chooses to keep whole, which it releases intact after 5,000 years, while letting others dissolve after 500. Could it be that the manner of burial mattered more than we understand? That certain practices, certain orientations, certain accompanying materials created micro-environments within the permafrost that enhanced preservation beyond what the cold alone could provide? Were the peoples who buried their dead in this frozen ground aware of techniques we have not yet identified, methods of preparing a body or sealing a grave that worked in concert with the permafrost to achieve results we cannot replicate? And then there is the matter of what these bodies carry with them. The tattoos are perhaps the most striking feature, intricate patterns covering limbs and torsos, designs that speak of a symbolic vocabulary we can only partially decode. The Pazyryk mummies of the Altai, discovered in frozen tombs during the 20th century, bore some of the most elaborate tattoos ever found on ancient bodies. Images of deer and griffins, of fantastic beasts and spiraling geometric forms, all executed with a precision that suggests not casual decoration, but deliberate inscription of meaning into flesh. Mainstream scholarship interprets these tattoos as markers of identity, of clan affiliation, of status within a hierarchical society. The designs are beautiful, certainly, but they are also explicable as social signifiers, no different in function from the tattoos worn by peoples across the ancient world. Yet the positioning of these tattoos, the specific locations on the body where they appear, the correspondence between tattoo placement and acupuncture points or meridian lines recognized by traditional Asian medicine, raises questions that mainstream archaeology has not fully addressed. Were these decorations, or were they something more? Perhaps a form of therapeutic or spiritual technology, a map inscribed on the skin to guide energies or mark passages that the dead would need to navigate in whatever realm they believed awaited them. The Pazyryk woman known as the Ice Maiden, discovered in 1993 on the Ukok Plateau, bore tattoos on her shoulders and fingers that local Altai peoples immediately recognized as spiritually significant, claiming her as an ancestor, a priestess, a figure of reverence who should never have been disturbed. The scientific establishment dismissed these claims as superstition, as the projection of modern belief onto ancient remains. But the locals insisted that the tattoos marked her as a keeper of knowledge, that her burial with horses and cannabis and mirrors was not merely grave goods, but a complete ritual kit, assembled with intention and precision for purposes we no longer understand. The toolkit that accompanies many of these ice-preserved bodies presents its own anomalies. The Ötzi discovery in the Alps, perhaps the most famous glacier mummy in the world, carried with him an assemblage of objects that challenged assumptions about Copper Age technology from the moment of his emergence in 1991. His copper axe was fully formed, hafted with expert binding, representing a level of metallurgical sophistication that pushed back the timeline of copper use in the Alpine region by centuries. His clothing included a bearskin cap, a woven grass cloak, leggings of goat leather, shoes insulated with grass. An ensemble so well adapted to alpine conditions that modern survivalists have struggled to replicate its effectiveness with period-appropriate materials. His quiver held arrows in various stages of completion, suggesting he was either a craftsman himself or had access to a production process that involved multiple specialists. His medicine pouch contained birch polypore fungus, a species with known antibiotic and antiparasitic properties, along with other organic materials whose functions remain debated. Mainstream science interprets Ötzi as a shepherd or a trader, perhaps a local leader given the quality of his axe, a man who met a violent end high in the mountains after an altercation that left an arrowhead lodged in his shoulder. His death is treated as an individual tragedy, the murder of one Copper Age man by another, a crime scene frozen for 5,000 years. The toolkit is remarkable, certainly, but ultimately consistent with what we might expect from a well-equipped traveller of his era. But the toolkit also contains objects that do not fit this narrative neatly. The tinder fungus and pyrite for fire starting suggest not a man fleeing for his life, but one prepared for a journey. The incomplete arrows suggest not a hunting expedition, but a craftsman's portable workshop. The presence of two species of moss, one used for insulation and one with no known practical function, suggests purposes we have not identified. Most puzzling of all is the distribution of Ötzi's tattoos, small groupings of lines and crosses positioned over joints and along the spine, locations that show signs of arthritic degeneration in his bones. Were these therapeutic marks, ancient attempts to address chronic pain? Were they ritual inscriptions, spiritual armour for a man who knew he was about to undertake a dangerous passage? Or were they something else entirely, a technology of the body that we have not recognised because we lack the framework to understand it? The Siberian finds multiply these questions exponentially. In the Sakha Republic, formerly Yakutia, the warming permafrost has released a steady stream of bodies over the past 2 decades, many of them dating to the medieval period or earlier, many of them accompanied by objects that suggest sophisticated material culture. Bronze ornaments appear alongside stone tools. Silk fragments, traded from China along routes that should not have extended so far north so early, wrap around bodies buried in what were supposed to be isolated primitive communities. The mainstream interpretation expands the map of ancient trade networks, acknowledges that northern peoples were less isolated than previously assumed, and incorporates these finds into a narrative of gradual technological diffusion from more advanced centres to peripheral regions. Yet the objects sometimes precede their supposed origins. Bronze appears before the local cultures should have had access to bronze. Silk appears before the Silk Road should have reached these latitudes. Techniques of preservation appear before any culture in the region should have possessed the knowledge to apply them. The bodies themselves show evidence of deliberate treatment, of post-mortem manipulation that enhanced their preservation, beyond what the permafrost alone could have achieved. Some show signs of what appears to be extraction of internal organs. Others show evidence of the application of organic substances to the skin, resins or plant extracts that formed a protective layer. Still others were buried in containers, in nesting coffins of larchwood that created sealed micro-environments within the larger permafrost matrix. Were these peoples practicing a form of mummification we have not formally recognised? Were they aware that the frozen ground would preserve what they buried, and did they prepare their dead specifically to take advantage of this, to ensure that the bodies would endure not for years but for millennia? If so, why? What belief? What cosmology? What understanding of death, and what comes after motivated such elaborate preparation? And why does that knowledge seem to vanish from the region, leaving later peoples to bury their dead in simpler fashion, without the techniques that their ancestors apparently possessed? The Altai Mountains offer perhaps the richest evidence of deliberate ice burial, of cultures that understood the preservative properties of their high-altitude environment and exploited them with systematic intention. The Pazyryk culture, flourishing roughly between the 6th and 3rd centuries BCE, left behind a series of frozen tombs that have astonished archaeologists since the first were opened in the 1920s. These were not accidental preservations, these were engineered environments. The tombs were dug into the permafrost layer, lined with logs, sealed with stone, and filled with materials that enhanced the natural cold. Water was apparently introduced deliberately, creating ice that encased the burial chamber and everything within it. The result was preservation so complete that when Russian archaeologist Sergei Rudenko opened the Pazyryk barrows in the 1940s and 50s, he found not only bodies but textiles, not only bones but felt, not only grave goods but food offerings still recognisable after 2,500 years. The mainstream interpretation frames the Pazyryk as a nomadic horse culture, related to the Scythians of the Western Steppes, a people whose lives centred on herding and raiding, and the constant movement that such an economy required. The frozen tombs are treated as elite burials, the graves of chiefs and their consorts, filled with the luxury goods that displayed status in life and accompanied the dead into whatever afterlife they imagined. The horses buried alongside the humans, sometimes 6 or more to a single tomb, are treated as grave goods, as transportation for the deceased in the spirit world, as displays of wealth comparable to the chariots buried with Egyptian pharaohs or Chinese emperors. But the details of these burials suggest more than status display. The bodies were not simply laid in their tombs, they were prepared with extensive evisceration, with the removal of muscles and organs, with the stuffing of cavities with grass and hair, with the sewing shut of incisions using sinew thread. They were embalmed, in other words, using techniques that parallel, but do not replicate the methods of other mummifying cultures. The heads of some individuals were trepanned, opened with surgical precision to remove the brain, a procedure performed not to treat any visible injury but as part of the mortuary protocol. Why? What did the Pazyryk believe happened to the brain after death? What did they think they were releasing, or preventing, by cutting away this organ before burial? The tattoos on the Pazyryk bodies are not random decoration but a coherent symbolic system. one that appears across multiple individuals buried at different sites, suggesting a shared vocabulary, a common understanding of what these images meant and why they should be inscribed on the skin of the dead. The deer motifs recur constantly, antlered figures in dynamic poses, sometimes realistic and sometimes fantastical, their antlers transformed into blooming branches, into flames, into the heads of birds. The griffin appears repeatedly, that hybrid creature of lion and eagle that appears across Scythian art, and seems to have held particular significance for these peoples. Were these images clan markers, totems, representations of the animals that protected or defined each individual's lineage? Or were they something more operational, a spiritual technology intended to transform the dead, to grant them powers or capabilities they would need in whatever state awaited them beyond the tomb? Standing in the Altai today, where the modern border between Russia, Kazakhstan, China and Mongolia meets at a high plateau swept by perpetual wind, one cannot help but sense the intentionality of these burial choices. The Pazyryk did not bury their dead here by accident. They chose this place, these elevations, these particular valleys where permafrost persisted even in summer, because they understood what the cold could do. They engineered their tombs to enhance the freezing, to seal out air, to create conditions that would preserve not just the bodies, but the entire material assemblage of the burial. They wanted these individuals to endure. They wanted them to remain whole, to remain equipped, to remain ready for something we can only guess at. What happened to this knowledge? The Pazyryk culture fades from the archaeological record around the 3rd century BCE, replaced by or absorbed into other peoples, other traditions, other ways of treating the dead. The elaborate frozen tombs cease, the embalming techniques vanish, the symbolic vocabulary of the tattoos disappears from the region, not to be seen again until the marks on the Ice Maiden's shoulders were revealed to modern eyes. A technique that had been refined over generations, that required coordination between mortuary specialists and tomb builders and artists, simply stops. Did the knowledge die with its practitioners? Was it deliberately abandoned? Or did it migrate elsewhere, carried by survivors or refugees to other lands, where we have not yet identified its continuation? Our drift through the ice-preserved anomalies must now turn westward, toward the Carpathian mountains of Eastern Europe, where a different kind of frozen archive has been discovered in the sealed cave systems of Romania and Ukraine. These are not permafrost burials, but ice caves, natural formations where cold air pools and persists year-round, where ice has accumulated over millennia in chambers far from sunlight, where temperatures remain stable and sub-freezing even as the surface world cycles through seasons. The caves were known to local peoples for centuries, sometimes used as natural refrigerators, sometimes avoided as uncanny places where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. But systematic exploration only began in the 20th century, and what researchers have found challenges assumptions about both the caves themselves and the peoples who once entered them. The ice in these caves is not uniform. It is layered, a frozen stratigraphy that records the passage of time in bands of clarity and opacity, in air bubbles and organic inclusions, in the remains of whatever entered the cave and was captured by the slowly growing ice. Among these inclusions are objects that should not have survived, offerings that should have decayed centuries or millennia ago, organic materials that exist now only because the ice chose to preserve them. Mainstream archaeology interprets the cave ice finds as evidence of ritual activity, of peoples who entered these cold spaces to make offerings or perform ceremonies, whose discarded materials were subsequently preserved by accident of location. The caves are treated as natural temples, liminal spaces where the chill and the darkness created an atmosphere conducive to spiritual practice. The offerings found within the ice, fragments of textile and worked wood and animal remains, are catalogued and analysed and incorporated into understandings of regional ritual behaviour, yet some of what has been found does not fit easily into this framework. In certain caves, the ice has yielded human remains, not complete bodies but isolated elements, bones and hair, and what appear to be deliberately prepared packages of organic material, sealed in containers made of bark or hide, placed into the ice with apparent intention. Were these burials? Were they sacrifices? Were they something else? Perhaps a form of preservation for materials that held sacred significance, relics of holy figures that communities wanted to keep intact across generations. The most puzzling finds are those that have not been fully published, that appear in preliminary reports and then vanish from the literature, that are described by researchers in conference presentations, but never appear in peer-reviewed journals. The ice caves of the Carpathians have yielded objects that certain teams have chosen not to disclose, materials that have been removed to storage facilities without further announcement, finds that seem to have been deliberately suppressed rather than studied and shared. Why would scientists conceal discoveries? What could the ice be releasing that institutional archaeology prefers to keep hidden? The pattern repeats in Siberia, where several significant permafrost finds of the past decade have been reburied shortly after discovery or transferred to facilities where no subsequent research has been announced. Official explanations cite indigenous concerns, the rights of local peoples to determine the fate of ancestral remains, and these concerns are legitimate and deserve respect. But the specific cases where reburial or concealment has occurred do not always involve indigenous objections. Some of the reburied finds were from periods before any modern population inhabited the region. Some were from ethnic groups that left no descendants, no communities to consult, no voices to raise objection. Yet they were returned to the ground or shipped to storage, and the researchers who found them have not spoken publicly about what they saw. What is in the permafrost that certain scientists prefer not to examine? What has emerged from the melting ice that challenges frameworks too deeply to publish? The question cannot be answered definitively, but the fact of suppression is itself a data point, a suggestion that the ice-preserved anomalies include not only what has been revealed, but what has been hidden, not only what has been studied, but what has been buried again. The phenomena of ice preservation forces a confrontation with our assumptions about time and decay, about what should and should not survive. We expect the past to be fragmentary. We expect organic materials to decompose, soft tissues to vanish, the ephemeral record of human life to reduce to durable objects alone. The ice defies this expectation. It returns bodies whole. It preserves not just bones but sinews, not just tools but their handles, not just burials but the flowers laid upon them. The climate is shifting. The permafrost is melting. The glaciers are retreating. Each year more finds emerge, more bodies surface, more objects that should have remained frozen forever are released into a warming world. Scientists race to retrieve what they can, to document what is appearing before decomposition claims what the ice preserved. But they cannot retrieve everything. They cannot be everywhere at once. Bodies are appearing in remote regions where no researchers walk, decomposing in summer sun before anyone knows they existed. Objects are washing out of riverbanks, carried downstream, scattered, lost. The archive is opening, but it is also dissolving, and what we recover represents only a fraction of what the ice held. Perhaps this is why some finds are reburied, why some are concealed, why certain researchers prefer to leave objects in the ground rather than extract them. Perhaps the archive is too large, too strange, too challenging to examine all at once. Perhaps institutional archaeology, with its frameworks and its funding cycles and its peer review processes, is not equipped to handle what the melting ice is releasing. Perhaps what lies frozen beneath the tundra and inside the glaciers and within the cave ice of mountain systems is not merely more of what we already know, but something different, something that would require a fundamental revision of how we understand the past. In the far northeastern corner of Siberia, on the coast of the Arctic Ocean, the permafrost extends beneath the sea itself, frozen submarine sediments that preserve not only land deposits, but the inundated terrain of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and this coastal shelf was dry land. What lies preserved in submarine permafrost has barely been explored. The technology to access it is expensive and limited. The conditions are hostile beyond anything land-based archaeology has encountered, but preliminary surveys have detected anomalies, organic signatures where no organic material should survive, structural features that do not match natural seafloor formations. What waits beneath the Arctic waters? What has the submarine permafrost preserved across 100 centuries, sealed beneath cold and pressure and darkness in conditions that exceed anything the land offers? The question may not be answered in our lifetimes. The technology to explore it is still developing. The political will to fund such exploration is inconsistent at best. But the anomalies detected in preliminary surveys suggest that the ice-preserved archive extends far beyond what we have yet examined, that the bodies and offerings and frozen burials discovered so far represent merely the accessible fraction of a much larger record, a record that includes not only the shores of the present, but the shores of the deep past, the lands that our ancestors walked before the waters rose. The ice is melting, the archive is opening. And what emerges challenges everything we thought we knew about the past, about preservation, about what the dead carry with them into the frozen ground, and what they choose to reveal when the cold releases its grip at last. The Siberian interior holds its own frozen narratives, its own dead who refuse to decompose, its own impossible survivals that the warming climate is now exposing to the air. Beyond the coastal reaches of the Arctic, beyond the submarine permafrost and its unexplored anomalies, the inland tundra stretches across millions of square kilometres, a landscape that appears featureless from above but conceals beneath its surface a layered record of occupation, passage, and burial, extending back through epochs that dwarf recorded history. The Yakutia region, known formerly as the Sakha Republic, encompasses territory larger than Argentina, yet supports a population smaller than many cities. Its permafrost runs deep, in some areas penetrating more than 1,000 metres below the surface, frozen ground that has remained continuously below zero for hundreds of thousands of years. What this frozen archive contains has only begun to surface, and what has surfaced has forced revisions to timelines, migrations and capabilities that textbooks once presented as settled. The Yana rhinoceros horn site, discovered on the banks of the Yana River in the early 2000s, yielded artifacts dating to 32,000 years ago, pushing back the established timeline for human presence in the high Arctic by at least 15,000 years. The site preserved not only stone tools but bone implements, worked mammoth ivory, and organic remains that in any other environment would have vanished within decades of deposition. Mainstream archaeology interprets the Yana site as evidence of sophisticated cold weather adaptation by anatomically modern humans who possessed the technology to survive Arctic winters, to hunt megafauna, to manufacture complex tools from materials available in a landscape devoid of trees. The evidence supports this reading. The artifacts demonstrate skill, planning, and cultural transmission across generations. Yet certain aspects of the Yana assemblage continue to invite deeper reflection. The ivory objects include decorated pieces, worked with care that exceeds functional necessity, carved with patterns that suggest symbolic meaning, even if that meaning remains opaque to modern interpreters. Who are these Arctic hunters? What cosmologies guided them across landscapes that should have been impassable? What drove them north into conditions that demanded every adaptation human ingenuity could provide? And what knowledge did they carry that allowed them to survive where survival seems impossible? The bodies emerging from permafrost across Siberia arrive not as skeletons but as preserved remains, their soft tissues intact, their facial features recognizable, their burial garments preserved in conditions that make them appear recently interred rather than millennia old. Near the village of Salikhard, in the Yamal-Nenets region, construction crews in 2012 disturbed a burial site that would later be dated to the 13th century, when this region formed part of a vast trade network connecting Arctic populations to markets in Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. The bodies recovered from this site were naturally mummified by permafrost, their features preserved, their clothing intact, wrappings of birch bark and reindeer hide still enfolding forms that had lain undisturbed for 800 years. One body, that of a child, was wrapped in copper, the metal folded around the small form in sheets that researchers initially interpreted as a burial practice of unusual lavishness. But examination revealed that the copper had served not merely as a status marker, but as a preservative, the metal's antimicrobial properties creating a microenvironment that enhanced the already exceptional preservation of the permafrost itself. Had the people who buried this child understood the preservative qualities of copper? Had they intentionally combined metal and ice to ensure that decay would never claim what they wished to preserve? The copper wrappings echo practices documented far to the south, in cultures that certainly never encountered permafrost yet developed sophisticated preservation techniques of their own. The resonance is suggestive, the implications are unsettling, and the questions multiply rather than resolve. Further south, where the Siberian taiga gives way to the steppes of Mongolia and the mountains of the Altai, the frozen tombs of the Scythian world present preservation so complete that their discoverers struggled to accept what they were seeing. The Pazyryk burials, excavated by Soviet archaeologists in the 1920s and 40s, yielded contents that belong in a museum of textiles rather than a collection of grave goods, preserved fabrics and felts and carpets that should have rotted to threads within years of interment, yet survived more than 2,000 years in conditions that arrested decay at the cellular level. The largest carpet recovered from Pazyryk, measuring nearly 2 meters on each side, displays knotting so fine that modern weavers have struggled to replicate it, patterns so intricate that art historians have spent decades debating their origins and meanings. The mainstream interpretation holds that this carpet represents the peak of nomadic textile production, evidence that Scythian cultures commanded sophisticated craft traditions even without permanent settlements or urban centres. The interpretation is reasonable, it is also incomplete. Where did the technique originate? How is it transmitted across the vast distances of the steppe? Why does the carpet style echo Persian court production of the same era, implying contact across thousands of kilometres of difficult terrain? And why does the knotting technique appear suddenly in the archaeological record without developmental precursors, as if the knowledge arrived fully formed and then vanished equally abruptly when the Scythian world collapsed? The human remains from Pazyryk present their own anomalies, their own refusals of simple explanation. The bodies bear tattoos, elaborate designs covering arms and shoulders and backs, preserved by the same ice that protected the textiles and the wooden burial goods and the sacrificed horses that accompanied the dead into the frozen ground. The tattoos depict creatures both real and fantastical, deer and griffins and beasts that seem to exist only in the mythology of the steppe, rendered in styles that demonstrate sophisticated artistic traditions and suggest cosmological systems of considerable complexity. Standing before these tattooed bodies in the Hermitage Museum, one cannot help but sense that the marks were not merely decorative but meaningful, that each design carried significance that the bearer would have understood even if that significance remains inaccessible to modern viewers. The mainstream reading holds that Scythian tattoos marked tribal affiliation, status, or spiritual power, visible symbols of invisible qualities that positioned the bearer within their social world. This reading accommodates the evidence. It does not exhaust it. Why do certain designs recur across bodies separated by centuries and hundreds of kilometers? What system of transmission ensured that a griffin carved in skin in the 6th century BCE would match a griffin carved 100 years later in a different burial, in a different valley, by artists who may never have met? The consistency implies either a centralized authority that prescribed designs, or a symbolic vocabulary so deeply embedded in Scythian consciousness that it remains stable across generations and distances. Neither implication is comfortable for models of nomadic societies, as loose confederations without institutional structures to preserve and transmit such knowledge. The preservation of Pazyryk was accidental, or so the mainstream interpretation holds, the result of water seeping into tomb chambers, freezing, and sealing the contents in ice that would persist until excavation. The explanation accounts for the physical process of preservation. It does not account for the location of the tombs, placed on north-facing slopes where permafrost was deepest and most stable, or for the construction techniques that seemed designed to facilitate water infiltration rather than prevent it, or for the consistent orientation that suggests intentionality rather than chance. Did the Pazyryk builders understand what they were doing? Did they know that the ice would form, that the preservation would last, that bodies and goods and horses would survive millennia in conditions that defeated ordinary decay? The question cannot be answered definitively, but the evidence is suggestive, and the coincidences are numerous enough to raise doubt about whether coincidence is the correct frame at all. The 21st century has added new bodies to the Siberian archive, finds so recent that they have not yet entered the established literature, that circulate instead through news reports and conference papers and the uncertain territory of preliminary announcements. In 2019, reindeer herders in the Yamal Peninsula discovered the remains of a cave lion cub, frozen so perfectly that it appeared to be sleeping, fur intact, whiskers preserved, facial expression suggesting the moment of death with an immediacy that photographs failed to capture. The cub dated to approximately 28,000 years ago, a representative of a species that vanished from the Earth in the last ice age, preserved so completely that researchers initially speculated about cloning before the practical obstacles of ancient DNA degradation forced more modest ambitions. The discovery was publicized widely. The photographs circulated across media platforms. The narrative followed familiar lines: scientific triumph, lost worlds restored to visibility, the wonders of the frozen archive. Less publicised were the bodies that emerged from the same warming landscape and entered not museum display but undisclosed storage, remains whose discovery generated not press releases but silence, finds that researchers documented and then, in certain cases, returned to the ground. The reasons offered vary. Some sites are too remote, the logistics of extraction prohibitively complex, the resources unavailable to preserve what the ice is releasing. Some finds are too incomplete, fragmentary remains not worth the institutional investment that full excavation would require. Some discoveries occur on indigenous lands where traditional authorities prefer that ancestors remain undisturbed, where the demands of scientific inquiry conflict with cultural protocols about the dead. These explanations are credible. They account for individual decisions and specific circumstances. They do not account for patterns, for the rumours that circulate among field researchers about bodies that do not match established timelines, about artefacts that appear technologically anachronistic, about organic materials that seem too well preserved even for permafrost, about data that contradicts frameworks so comprehensively that publication would require not revision, but reconstruction of foundational assumptions. What lies reburied in Siberian permafrost? What sealed crates hold specimens that have not been publicised, stored in facilities whose inventories remain outside peer-reviewed scrutiny? The questions have no verifiable answers. They cannot be confirmed or disproven from available evidence. They can only be asked again and again as the ice continues to melt and the archive continues to open, and the decisions about what to publicise and what to suppress remain largely invisible to the public that believes science operates in transparent consensus. The permafrost is not the only frozen archive. Glaciers hold their own dead, bodies sealed within ice that formed around them and preserved them across millennia until the warming climate returned them to the air. The most famous of these glacier dead, the one whose name has entered common vocabulary, is the man who emerged from the Ötztal Alps in 1991, the body known to researchers as the Iceman and to the public as Ötzi, preserved so perfectly that hikers who discovered him initially believed they had found a recent mountaineering casualty rather than a 5,000-year-old traveller. Ötzi has been studied more intensively than perhaps any other ancient human remains, subjected to CT scans and genetic analysis, and isotopic investigations and dietary reconstructions that together create a portrait of astonishing detail. We know what he ate in his final days. We know where he grew up, based on mineral traces in his teeth that match specific alpine valleys. We know that he suffered from arthritis and carried parasites and bore the healed wounds of earlier violence before the final arrow that killed him. We know that he carried with him a toolkit of remarkable sophistication, a copper axe whose blade was 99.7% pure, a bow and arrows, a flint knife, birch bark containers, medicinal fungi, and other provisions that suggest preparation for extended travel. The mainstream interpretation holds that Ötzi was a Copper Age herder or trader who met his end in violence on an alpine pass, a victim of interpersonal conflict whose body was preserved by chance in a glacier that happened to form around him. The interpretation is reasonable. It accounts for the evidence. It closes the file and files the case and moves on to other matters. Yet Ötzi continues to resist full explanation, continues to present anomalies that his interpreters acknowledge without resolving. The copper axe is the most frequently cited puzzle, a tool whose technological sophistication exceeds what the established timeline for alpine metallurgy would predict, whose blade was cast using techniques that textbooks assign to later centuries, whose presence in a Copper Age toolkit suggests either that the timeline is wrong or that the spread of metallurgical knowledge was faster and more complex than the models allow. The axe connects Ötzi to networks that extended across hundreds of kilometres, to sources of copper that were already being exploited by populations who understood extraction, smelting, and casting at levels that transform how we understand their capabilities. But it is not the axe alone that puzzles researchers. Ötzi bore tattoos, 61 of them distributed across his body in patterns that long predated any documented tattooing tradition in Europe, marks that correspond in many cases to acupuncture points that would not be formally codified until millennia later in East Asia. Were the tattoos therapeutic? Were they cosmological? Were they markers of identity, status, or spiritual power? The question has generated a literature of its own, theories that compete with that resolution, interpretations that accommodate some evidence while ignoring other details. The mainstream consensus holds that the tattoos were probably therapeutic, folk medicine applied to areas of chronic pain, a Copper Age approximation of practices that later cultures would develop more systematically. The consensus is plausible. It is not proven. It cannot account for the precision of placement, for the correspondence with energetic points that had no recognized significance in European medicine until contact with Asian traditions thousands of years later. Were the tattoos evidence of knowledge that was lost, therapeutic systems that vanished when Ötzi's culture gave way to successor populations who did not inherit what the Copper Age had known? The glacier that held Ötzi for 5 millennia was not unique. Alpine ice fields have released other bodies, other artifacts, other fragments of lives lived long before recorded history began. Monte San Giacomo in Italy yielded a Mesolithic hunter in 2008, remained so fragmentary that reconstruction proved impossible, but preservation sufficient to establish dates 10,000 years before present. The Schneedejoch Pass in Switzerland has disgorged a continuous stream of artifacts as its glacier retreats, leather garments and wooden implements and arrow shafts that span 6,000 years of alpine passage, objects dropped or discarded or lost by travellers who used the high routes when conditions allowed and whose traces remained frozen until the present warming released them. Each find represents a life, a journey, a moment sealed in ice and delivered to the future by the climate's changing hand. Each find raises questions that its discoverers acknowledge without answering. Why this pass? Why these travellers? What drew successive generations to routes that demanded everything human endurance could provide, that claimed lives and preserved them for millennia in the same frozen gesture? The caves of the Carpathian mountains hold their own ice, their own sealed archives, their own refusals of decay that the warming climate is now beginning to unlock. Scarășoara Cave in Romania contains one of the largest underground glaciers in Europe, a mass of ice that has persisted for more than 3,000 years, layered accumulations that record climatic shifts in their chemistry and trap within their mass whatever was present when each layer formed. The cave has been a site of ritual activity for centuries, perhaps millennia, and the ice preserves offerings that would have vanished in any other environment, organic materials that arrived as devotional objects and remained as frozen witnesses to beliefs that their depositors did not record in any other medium. Botanical remains recovered from Scarășoara ice include plant species that do not grow in the region today, vegetation that implies either long-distance transport or radically different local conditions at the time of deposition. Animal remains include species that range from expected to anomalous, creatures whose presence in a ritual context suggests symbolic frameworks that we can identify without understanding. The mainstream interpretation holds that Scarășoara served as a pilgrimage site, a sacred threshold where the natural cold and the perpetual ice suggested contact with otherworldly forces, a portal that successive cultures recognized and honored without leaving records that would explain their devotions. The interpretation is reasonable. It is also frustratingly incomplete. What made this cave sacred? What cosmologies placed significance in underground ice, in the perpetual cold that defied seasonal rhythms, in the preservation that the ice provided? The offerings were not casual. They were transported over considerable distances, selected with care, deposited in patterns that suggest intentionality, even if that intention remains opaque. The communities that made these pilgrimages possessed knowledge about ice preservation that their descendants did not inherit, that was lost when the cultures that held it gave way to successor populations who used the caves differently or not at all. The sealed chambers of Carpathian cave systems extend beyond Scarășoara, labyrinthine passages where ice formations persist year-round, and organic materials survive that would rot within seasons in ordinary conditions. Survey work in the 2010s documented intact offerings in chambers that had not been entered since deposition, sealed by rockfalls or ice barriers that prevented access until modern exploration breached them. The offerings included textiles, basketwork, leather goods, and botanical materials that their discoverers initially believed must be recent hoaxes given their state of preservation. Dating proved otherwise. The materials range from medieval to Bronze Age, preserved so perfectly that their colours remained visible, their textures remained pliable, their construction details remained available for analysis in ways that analogous objects from non-frozen contexts could never provide. What these offerings represent, What belief systems motivated their deposition, what the depositors hoped to achieve by sealing organic materials in chambers of perpetual cold, the questions multiply faster than they resolve. The mainstream interpretation speaks of votive practice, of gifts to chthonic powers, of boundary rituals that mark the cave as liminal space between worlds. The interpretation provides vocabulary. It does not provide understanding. The 2020 decade has added new finds to the frozen archives, bodies and objects emerging from ice that had held them since ages that dwarf recorded history, discoveries that made headlines briefly and then receded from public attention as subsequent news cycles displaced them. In 2021, archaeologists in Norway announced the recovery of an Iron Age ski from melting ice on Digervarden mountain. A wooden implement preserved so completely that its binding straps remained intact, attached to a form that predated the Viking Age by centuries, and demonstrated that Nordic populations had mastered winter mobility technology far earlier than established timelines had suggested. The ski joined a growing collection of glacial finds from Norwegian mountains, textiles and tools and organic materials that the retreating ice continues to release, a cascade of objects that overwhelms the capacity of institutions to process them, that accumulates in storage faster than researchers can analyse what previous seasons have provided. The sheer volume of material presents its own puzzle. How many travellers crossed these heights? How many objects remain waiting in ice that has not yet melted? What will emerge as the warming continues, and the glaciers that have persisted since the last ice age finally surrender their contents? The Norwegian finds receive publication, enter the literature, become part of the established record. But rumours persist of finds that do not receive publication, objects whose characteristics resist easy classification, remains that contradict rather than confirm what the literature contains. The rumours cannot be verified. They circulate among field researchers and emerge in conference corridors and retreat when documentation is requested. The Altai mountains continue to yield their dead, bodies emerging from burial mounds where ice formed within the tomb chambers and preserved what ordinary burial would have consumed. In 2006, a joint German-Mongolian expedition recovered a Scythian warrior from a frozen kurgan in the Mongolian Altai, a body whose preservation exceeded even the famous Pazyryk finds, whose tattoos remained vibrant, whose grave goods included textiles of remarkable complexity and weapons of sophisticated metallurgy. The warrior joined collections in Ulaanbaatar and became a centerpiece of exhibitions that drew international attention. His companions, the other occupants of the same burial complex whose tombs had not yet been opened when funding and permits expired, remain in the ground, frozen still, waiting for expeditions that may or may not arrive before the ice that preserves them yields to the warming climate. How many unopened kurgans dot the Altai landscape? How many frozen bodies await discovery in tomb chambers that have not been breached since the Scythian world collapsed? The surveys suggest hundreds, perhaps thousands, burial mounds whose ice cores may or may not have formed, whose contents may or may not have survived, whose excavation would require resources that no institution currently possesses. The archive remains largely sealed. What has emerged represents a fraction of what the mountains hold, and decisions about what to excavate and what to leave, what to publicise and what to store without announcement, remain with researchers whose criteria for selection are not always transparent. The dead are speaking, those who were frozen into silence millennia ago, those whose bodies carry stories that their cultures did not otherwise record. They speak through their tattoos and their toolkits, through their offerings and their burial goods, through the positions in which they were placed and the companions who were interred beside them. They speak, and we struggle to understand what they say, to interpret symbols whose meanings died with their bearers, to reconstruct cosmologies from fragments that survive only because ice arrested the decay that would otherwise have claimed them. The frozen archives challenge the assumption that the past reduces inevitably to durable objects, that soft tissues vanish, that organic materials decompose, that what we recover represents the limits of what survived. The ice preserved more. The ice preserved bodies whole. The ice preserved not only what was meant to last, but what was meant to be ephemeral, the flowers on the grave, the food in the offering bowl, the fabric that wrapped the corpse. The preservation is a gift and a burden, evidence so complete that interpretation becomes both more possible and more demanding, context so rich that every explanation reveals its own inadequacy. The cultures that froze their dead into the permafrost and the glaciers and the cave ice of mountain systems did not survive. They vanished, absorbed into successor populations or displaced by migrations, or collapsed by changes that their descendants did not record. What they knew, they carried into the frozen ground with them. What they believed, they demonstrated through practice rather than inscription. What they preserved was not preserved deliberately, or perhaps it was, and either answer raises questions that cannot be resolved from the evidence available. The Scythians who buried their chiefs in the Altai did not leave texts explaining why they sacrificed horses and servants to accompany the dead. The Copper Age traveller who became Otzi did not leave accounts of what his tattoos meant, or why his axe was so sophisticated, or what journey he was making when the arrow found him on the mountain pass. The communities who deposited offerings in Carpathian cave ice did not explain what powers they hoped to contact, or what blessings they sought by leaving perishable goods in chambers of perpetual cold. The knowledge is lost, the practices are visible, the meaning hovers just beyond reach, tantalizingly present in the material record yet inaccessible to interpreters who come 5,000 years, 2,000 years, 1,000 years too late to ask the questions that would resolve what the objects suggest. And so the frozen archives become monuments to absence as much as presence, testimonies not only to what cultures achieved, but to what they carried away when they departed, leaving behind bodies that outlasted belief systems, artifacts that survived the cosmologies that gave them purpose. The ice preserved form while meaning melted. The flesh remained while intention dissolved. And those who study what emerges must construct interpretations from surfaces, must read symbols whose dictionaries were never written, must reconstruct rituals whose participants took their explanations into the same frozen ground that preserved their physical remains. The 21st century has accelerated this confrontation between preservation and interpretation, between the expanding archive and the contracting time available to study it. The permafrost that held intact for millennia has begun to release its contents at rates that outpace any institutional capacity to respond. Across Siberia, across Mongolia, across the high mountain systems of Central Asia and the ice caves of Eastern Europe, warming temperatures are opening tombs that were never meant to be opened, exposing materials that will decompose within seasons if not recovered, revealing bodies and artifacts and organic assemblages that represent finite opportunities for study. The archive is opening. The archive is also closing. What emerges must be collected, stabilised, analysed before the same conditions that revealed it destroy it, and the resources required for this work exceed what any nation or institution currently commits. In the summer of 2019, a survey team working along the Indigirka River in northeastern Siberia documented the emergence of what appeared to be a large mammal carcass from a collapsing riverbank. The permafrost in this region had been slumping for years, releasing methane from decomposing organic material, exposing layers that had been frozen since the Pleistocene. Mammoth tusks had been emerging from similar deposits throughout the region, feeding an ivory trade that operated in legal and ethical grey zones, providing income to communities whose traditional economies had been disrupted by the same climate shifts that were releasing the tusks. But this carcass was not a mammoth. The proportions were wrong, the placement was unexpected, the state of preservation suggested something other than a Pleistocene megafauna specimen. What the survey team had found was human. More specifically, what they had found was a group burial, multiple individuals interred together in a grave that the river had gradually undercut as the permafrost supporting the bank retreated. The bodies had begun to emerge head first, the frozen ground releasing its grip in the direction of the flowing water, and the survey team photographed what they saw before the current authorities could be notified, before decisions could be made about excavation or reburial, or the disposition of remains whose cultural affiliation was not immediately clear. The photographs circulated among researchers before being withdrawn from public channels. What they showed was extraordinary. The bodies appeared to be clothed, wrapped in layered textiles whose colours remained visible despite what might have been centuries or millennia in frozen ground. Metal objects glinted at throats and wrists, ornaments or fasteners or ritual objects whose purpose could not be determined from images. The faces were largely intact, preserved in expressions that suggested the moment of death, or the deliberate positioning of features by those who prepared the bodies for burial. And the number of individuals visible in the eroding bank, only partially exposed before the survey team departed, suggested a mass interment whose scale exceeded what researchers typically encountered in this region. 6 bodies were clearly visible. The contours of the bank suggested more remained within. What happened next remains disputed. According to official accounts, the site was secured, the remains were excavated under controlled conditions, and the materials were transported to facilities where they could be studied and preserved. According to unofficial accounts, which circulated among researchers who requested anonymity, the site was visited by multiple parties before any official excavation occurred, and what was ultimately recovered represented a fraction of what the bank had originally contained. The photographs disappeared from the channels where they had been shared. Inquiries about the site received responses that varied from denial of its existence to assurances that appropriate procedures had been followed, to suggestions that the finds were less significant than initial reports had indicated. The Indigirka remains, if they existed at all in the form the photographs suggested, had entered the Shadow Archive, the collection of materials whose existence is known but whose location and status cannot be verified. This pattern recurs. The 2020s have produced multiple accounts of permafrost finds that emerged, were documented, and then vanished from public knowledge without clear explanation. In 2021, a construction project in the Yamal Peninsula exposed what workers described as a frozen human body in a seated position, clothed in garments that did not resemble anything from historical periods known to have inhabited the region. Photographs were taken on personal devices before supervisors arrived. The project was halted. When it resumed several weeks later, the area where the find had been reported showed signs of excavation, but no official announcement about discoveries was made. The workers who had photographed the find were reassigned. The photographs themselves became objects of speculation in online communities dedicated to anomalous discoveries, their authenticity debated, their implications discussed, their ultimate disposition unknown. What explains this pattern of discovery and disappearance, of revelation and retraction, of finds that emerge from the melting ice only to vanish into institutional silences? The explanations offered by researchers who discuss such matters off the record are multiple and not mutually exclusive. Some finds, they suggest, raise questions that institutions prefer not to address, challenges to establish timelines or cultural affiliations that would require revisions too extensive to be convenient. Some finds have commercial value that makes their quiet disposition more profitable than their public study. Some finds emerge in regions where political sensitivities make certain discoveries unwelcome, where evidence of particular populations or practices conflicts with preferred historical narratives. And some finds, perhaps, present characteristics so unusual that no framework exists to interpret them, anomalies that researchers themselves do not know how to explain, which are therefore removed from public discourse until explanation becomes possible. The frozen archives are opening. But not everything that emerges is being shared. The Carpathian cave ice systems offer a smaller scale version of the same dynamic, discoveries that are documented, studied to varying degrees, and then subjected to decisions about access and publication that are not always transparent. A cave system in Romania, explored by a team that included both professional researchers and experienced amateur cavers in 2018, was found to contain ice formations that had preserved organic materials in remarkable condition. Leather artifacts, textile fragments, wooden objects, and what appeared to be food offerings were recovered from ice pockets deep within the cave, their placement suggesting deliberate deposition rather than accidental loss, their variety suggesting repeated visits over extended periods. The dating of the ice itself, using techniques that measure trapped gases and isotope ratios, placed the formation of the preservation medium at various periods ranging from 3,000 to 800 years before present, suggesting that the cave had been used as a ritual repository across multiple millennia. The finds were initially publicised in regional media, attracting attention from researchers who specialised in the prehistoric and early historic communities of the Carpathian region. Permission to study the materials was sought by multiple institutions, and then the cave was sealed. The official explanation cited conservation concerns, the need to protect fragile ice formations from the thermal intrusion of human visitors, the risk that continued access would destroy the very conditions that had preserved what the cave contained. The finds themselves were transferred to a museum whose public displays did not include the cave materials, whose storage facilities were not open to outside researchers, whose responses to inquiries about access became progressively less specific over the years that followed. Were the finds as significant as initial reports suggested? Were there characteristics that complicated their interpretation? Were there stakeholders whose preferences shaped decisions about what would be studied and what would be stored? The questions multiply. The answers do not arrive. Yet not all finds vanish. Not all discoveries enter the shadow archive. The frozen specimens that do reach public study produce revelations that suggest how much the vanished finds might have revealed if they had been available for comparable analysis. Consider the ongoing research into Scythian remains from the Altai, the bodies that were excavated with full documentation and subjected to every available technique of study. The tattoos alone have produced papers, exhibitions, documentaries, debates that continue to generate new interpretations decades after the bodies were recovered. The animal motifs that cover the preserved skin of the Pazyryk chieftains represent not merely decoration but communication, statements in a visual language whose grammar scholars are still attempting to reconstruct. The deer that transform into griffins, the felines that curl into impossible positions, the predators that pursue prey in spiraling compositions that follow the contours of shoulders and arms and legs, all speak to a symbolic system whose sophistication equals that of any literate culture, whose meanings were understood by those who wore the images and those who saw them. What did it mean to wear a deer transforming into a griffin on one's shoulder? What status did it confer? What obligations did it impose? What beliefs about transformation, about the permeability of categories that modern taxonomy treats as fixed, did these images express? The bodies speak. The language remains partially untranslated. And beyond the tattoos, the toolkits, the weapons, the riding equipment, the gold and textile and wood and leather goods that accompanied the burials produced their own cascade of questions. The Pazyryk tombs contained complete chariots, wheeled vehicles whose construction required specialized knowledge, whose presence in high mountain burials implied either that the vehicles had been carried up slopes too steep for wheeled travel, or that routes existed that have since been lost or transformed. The tombs contained hemp-burning equipment, braziers and seeds that suggest practices of fumigation, or intoxication, or vision-seeking that later Greek sources attributed to the Scythians. The tombs contained carpets whose knotting techniques were thought to have developed centuries later in different regions, textiles whose sophistication challenges assumptions about when and where certain technologies emerged. Each object opens new questions. Each burial good reveals another assumption that requires revision. The dead of the frozen tombs do not merely survive, they instruct, they correct, they demonstrate that what seemed settled was provisional, that what seemed understood was incomplete. The caves of the Carpathians, the permafrost of Siberia, the glaciers of the Alps and Altai, the ice-sealed tombs that dot the mountain systems of Inner Asia, all represent a single phenomenon manifested across geography, the preservation of the ephemeral, the survival of what was meant to perish. For most of human history, the organic majority of material culture has vanished within generations of its creation. Cloth rots, leather decays, wood disintegrates, food becomes soil. The body returns to its elements within years or decades of death, faster in warm and wet conditions, slower in dry and cold ones, but inevitably, irreversibly, completely in all but exceptional circumstances. What archaeology typically recovers is the durable minority, the stone and ceramic and metal objects that resist decomposition, the fraction of material culture that was designed to last or happened to last despite design. The frozen archives invert this ratio. They preserve what was never meant to be preserved. They reveal what cultures assumed would vanish: the everyday objects, the worn garments, the half-eaten meals, the flowers placed on graves that were expected to wilt and disappear, the soft tissues that were expected to rejoin the cycle of decay and renewal that cultures understood even when they could not explain it in modern terms. This is why the frozen finds disturb as much as they illuminate. They were not meant to survive. The cultures that created them did not build for permanence in the way that pyramid builders or megalith erectors built for permanence. They built for function, for immediate use, for the short term that was the only term they expected their creations to experience. The axe that Ötzi carried was sophisticated but not monumental. The textiles in the Pazyryk tombs were exquisite but not intended as eternal messages. The offerings in the Carpathian caves were powerful but impermanent, food and leather and wood that would degrade in any environment other than the one where they were placed. The ice made permanent what was meant to be temporary. The cold arrested what was meant to continue, and now, as the cold releases its grip, As the ice yields to warming that accelerates each decade, these temporarily permanent objects are becoming permanently temporary again, rejoining the cycle of decay that their makers always expected them to join, only delayed by conditions that could not last forever. The urgency is real. The timescales are measured in years, not centuries. Permafrost that took millennia to form is degrading in decades. Glaciers that accumulated over ice ages are retreating in lifetimes. The frozen archives are opening, revealing contents that will decompose if not recovered, materials that will return to the oblivion that their makers intended for them. And the capacity to respond, to excavate and stabilize and study what emerges, does not match the pace of emergence. Choices must be made. Some finds will be recovered, others will be documented and left. Others will disappear without documentation, seen by no one, known to no one, returning to the earth before anyone notices that they emerged. The ice is speaking, and no one is present to record what it says. What remains when the accounting is complete, when the final balance is struck between what was preserved and what was lost, what was studied and what vanished, what reached the archive and what returned to the ground. The cultures that froze their dead into the tundra and the mountains and the caves are gone. They left no texts, no inscriptions, no self-explanations that survive in readable form. What they left are bodies and objects, materials that were meant to accompany the dead into whatever existence followed death. Provisions for journeys whose destinations their descendants forgot. The frozen archives are libraries written in a language no one fully speaks, messages composed in symbols whose dictionaries were never compiled, questions asked in a syntax that modern interpreters can approximate but not master. The ice preserved the question. The answer melted before anyone knew to ask. Yet there is meaning in incompleteness, wisdom in acknowledging what cannot be known. The frozen bodies that emerge from the melting permafrost and the retreating glaciers and the opening cave systems do not need to be fully understood to be significant. Their significance lies in their challenge to certainty, their refusal to confirm what was assumed, their insistence that the past was stranger and more various than the survivors remembered, than the successors recorded, than the scholars reconstructed from the fragments that persisted without ice to preserve them. The knowledge is lost, the presence remains. The tattooed skin speaks even when the language is unknown. The offerings testify even when the gods they addressed have no names that survive. The frozen archives are monuments to what cannot be recovered, testimonies to absence that are nonetheless testimonies, evidence of loss that is also evidence of having possessed what was lost. Something was known, something was believed, something was practiced with skill and devotion and consistency across generations and geographies. The something vanished. The evidence that it existed did not. The ice is melting, the archives are opening. The dead are emerging from the conditions that preserved them, yielding their secrets and their mysteries to a world that was not expecting them, that does not fully understand them, that will study what it can recover and speculate about what it cannot. The cultures that froze their dead into silence did not survive, but the dead survived. They survived long enough to speak again, in languages of bone and skin and offering, in grammars of placement and position and preservation that scholars struggle to pass. They speak, and we listen imperfectly, incompletely, across distances of time that reduce understanding to approximation, intention to inference, meaning to possibility. The frozen archives are closing as they open, revealing as they conceal, granting access to materials that will outlast no one's lifetime unless new conditions preserve them again. What the ice gave, the warmth is taking back. What was frozen is thawing. What was preserved is perishing. And in the narrow window between the opening and the closing, the preservation and the decay, the emergence and the return, something can be learned. What that something is remains uncertain. It will be debated for as long as the materials survive to be studied, interpreted, reinterpreted by generations of scholars whose questions will differ from those asked today. The frozen archives do not close arguments, they open them. They do not answer what ancient peoples knew. They demonstrate that ancient peoples knew things, and that some of those things were complex, and that many of those things are lost. The Siberian mummies will yield DNA and stable isotopes and pathology reports, data that will be plotted on graphs and entered into databases and compared with other data from other bodies from other places and times. The Altai tombs will produce artifact studies, iconographic analyses, theories of trade and contact that will themselves be revised when new finds emerge or new techniques are applied. The Carpathian caves will remain sealed or will be opened again, their contents studied or stored, their mysteries addressed or deferred. The patterns are visible, the explanations hover just beyond the evidence, tantalizingly possible, perpetually incomplete. One fact remains constant across all the frozen archives, all the ice-preserved anomalies, all the bodies and offerings and artifacts that the cold surrenders to the warming world. The cultures that created them vanished. The Scythians are gone. The Copper Age travellers whose representative became Ötzi are gone. The communities that deposited offerings in Carpathian caves are gone. The populations whose members emerged from Siberian permafrost are gone. What they knew, they did not record. What they believed, they did not explain. What they achieved, they did not document for posterity that might wish to replicate their achievements. They lived. They died. They were frozen into archives they did not intend to create, and now they emerge, speaking languages no one taught us to understand, testifying to truths no one preserved in forms we can read, demonstrating that the past was not what we assumed, that knowledge existed and was lost, that technologies emerged and vanished, that the story we tell about what humans knew, and when they knew, it is incomplete in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. The ice remembers what we forgot. The cold preserved what heat would have erased. The frozen archives are messages from cultures that did not mean to send them, received by descendants who do not know how to read them, studied by scholars who will spend careers attempting translations that remain provisional, tentative, uncertain. There are no definitive answers in the frozen ground, no final revelations in the glacial tombs, no conclusive interpretations in the cave ice of the mountains. There are only bodies, and objects, and contexts, and the questions they raise, multiplying faster than any methodology can address them, persisting longer than any theory can resolve them. The frozen archives are opening. They will close again, eventually, when the ice is gone and the contents have decayed, and the window of access is sealed shut forever. What we learn before then is what we will know. What we fail to learn will join the silence that already contains so much. The dead are speaking. They have been speaking for millennia, into the cold that held their words, into the ice that kept their testimonies intact. Now the cold is releasing them. Now the ice is yielding. Now the words are audible, briefly, fragmentarily, in languages we glimpse without grasping, in symbols we recognize without understanding. The frozen archives wait, patient and temporary, permanent and passing, open and closing with each season that warms the ground that held them. What they offer cannot be taken for granted. What they reveal cannot be assumed to remain. The ice is thawing. The bodies are emerging. The past is surfacing from the frozen silence where it waited, and the question that remains is not what it means, but whether we will be listening when it finishes what it has to say.